What would you think if I told you that the kindest person in your life, the one who always listens, always forgives, always smiles even while their heart quietly bleeds, is the very person who holds a power to destroy, in a way you never saw coming? Picture an old wooden bridge stretching across a quiet river. Year after year, heavy footsteps pass over it, yet no one ever stops to look back. Rain, wind, and mud wear it down slowly. But the bridge never complains. It just holds, endures, in silence, until one day, just one final step, and the whole structure collapses. Not because that last footfall was too heavy, but because of all the unseen fractures that came before. The empath is that bridge. Everyone walks across them, but few ever stop to see their soul. They feel so deeply for others. They forget themselves. And the manipulator, the one whose ego is inflated like a balloon, smells their softness like a predator scents blood. He wears a mask of pain, of helplessness, and quietly sinks his claws into the empath's compassion, until love becomes a leash. Carl Jung once warned, any endurance not rooted in inner freedom will eventually feed the shadow. When the empath is pushed to their breaking point, they don't scream, they don't strike back, they rise and walk away. But when they do, they don't just leave the relationship behind. They shatter the illusion. They are no longer the bridge. They become the one who decides who gets to walk beside them from now on. When the empath wakes up, it's not a sudden outburst. It's a slow, steady dawn, breaking through the fog, quiet, inevitable, not destructive, but irreversible. What they once tolerated for years, the twisted words, the emotional manipulation, the same hollow apologies over and over, they now see clearly, all the way to the root. They no longer ask, what did I do wrong? They begin to ask, why did I allow this for so long? And that is the first step in what Jung called the process of individuation. The sacred path where a soul begins to separate itself from the shadows of others' expectations, from roles, from wounds they once absorbed as their own. They stop defining themselves by how much they can endure. They stop idolizing their kindness, because they finally realize there is a more subtle kind of darkness, the darkness of always trying to be the good one. And within that darkness, the empath's ego quietly morphs. They no longer live for themselves, but for approval. They no longer love out of freedom, but out of duty. And buried deep within lies a fear, the fear of being disliked, the fear of being left behind, the fear of being no one, if they are not the one who always understands. But when they break that cycle, something remarkable happens. The manipulator loses control, not because the empath fights, but because they take back their gaze. And without that gaze, the narcissist is just a mirror no one looks into. Empty, powerless. This is not revenge. This is a return to self. With every step toward their inner light, the empath must walk through a terrain many fear forever, the realm of their own shadow. As Jung described, this isn't the evil part of them, it's everything they once rejected in order to be loved: anger, fatigue, a yearning to be seen, to be prioritized, to say no fearlessly. When the empath faces their shadow, they no longer fear raw emotions. They see that their past yielding and silence were not noble. They were the manifestations of an inner child who learned love means sacrificing oneself. But now, the child has grown. They no longer want to be a hostage in someone else's story. The narcissist, who once manipulated through grief-ridden looks and half-spoken words like daggers, begins to feel emptiness because the empath no longer reacts as before. They don't explain, don't reconcile, don't apologize for speaking truth. Their silence speaks instead. And in that silence, a new strength is born. Not a force to overpower, but to preserve the self, even when someone tries to distort reality. They no longer need to be understood to know they're right. They no longer fear being labeled selfish simply for setting boundaries. Jung wrote that once you look directly at the shadow, it can no longer control you from behind. In that moment, the empath stops carrying the emotional burdens of others and becomes the keeper of their own soul. Goodreads.com. From that moment on, something profound shifts within, quietly, steadily, like roots growing deep into the earth. The empath begins to distinguish what is love, and what is dependency, what is connection, and what is a binding rope wrapped in sweet promises. Then they glance back at the journey behind, with eyes no longer blurred by tears. They see how they once became a soft cushion for souls unwilling to take responsibility. How they bore others' pain as if the world would collapse if they let go. But now they understand. No one deserves to carry pain for someone who refuses to face it. Awakening does not arrive as a sudden lightning bolt. It unfolds as the slow disintegration of a wrong dream. The empath realizes that love does not mean enduring. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. And kindness, if not guided by wisdom, can become the foothold for manipulation. When boundaries are drawn, the narcissist recoils, not because they're confronted, but because they're no longer permitted in. The empath's silence is no longer a wound, it is a declaration. There's no pleading gaze, no outstretched hand begging for return. Only a clear presence. I am here. And I won't return to a place that asked me to forget who I am. The process of individuation is not a march toward perfection. It's a journey toward truth, even when that truth makes us impossible to control. And then one day, on the surface, just like any other day, the empath wakes up and feels nothing. No more pain from being blamed. No more fear of the silent treatment. No more urge to rescue anyone. The behaviors that used to confuse and torment them now feel like an old movie, repeating itself so many times it's lost all weight. This isn't cruelty. It's clarity. For so long, the empath held onto the belief, if I'm just more patient, more loving, maybe they'll change. But now they understand. That was the most dangerous trap of all. Because no one will change unless they want to. And no one should sacrifice their self-respect just to keep a damaging relationship going. The empath's silence now isn't from hurt, it's a conscious decision. I'm done playing this game. They're not searching for reasons to stay. They're not trying to make the other person understand. They simply walk away. No tears, no accusations. Just a quiet withdrawal, and to the manipulator, that is the most painful blow. Carl Jung once said that a person becomes truly strong only when they are no longer controlled by the parts of themselves they don't understand. And when an empath finally realizes that kindness is not an obligation, and love does not mean self-sacrifice, they are no longer an easy target. They don't seek revenge. They simply let go. And that is what makes the manipulator's sense of power fall apart. When the empath lets go, they're not just leaving a relationship. They're leaving behind an old version of themselves. The one who said, yes, while screaming, no, inside. The one who kept the peace while slowly falling apart. The one who believed, if I'm just good enough, kind enough, I'll finally be loved for real. But now they understand. No one deserves a love that costs them their voice and their peace. No one is worth losing your values and emotions just to be kept in their life. This change didn't happen overnight. It came after years of carrying too much. After countless moments sitting alone wondering, am I crazy? Why does something feel so off? But I can't explain it? That's the effect of emotional manipulation. A subtle kind of destruction that makes you question your own reality. But once the empath starts trusting their intuition, once they believe that feeling of unease in their chest instead of the sweet, contradictory words, they can't be misled so easily anymore. They no longer need to prove anything. They no longer seek validation. They see clearly who truly cares, and who's just feeding off their kindness. And most importantly, they are no longer afraid of being alone. Because temporary loneliness is far more peaceful than staying in a relationship that forces you to betray yourself every day. When the empath finally steps out of the savior role, They are no longer weak. They become free. This kind of freedom isn't loud. It doesn't scream, "I've moved on." It reveals itself in the smallest choices. Declining a call you don't want to take. Not replying to a manipulative message. Daring to say no without feeling guilty. An empath's freedom lies in no longer automatically trying to please everyone. In the past, they were afraid of upsetting others, afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of being told they were too sensitive or overreacting. But now, they no longer ask for permission to feel. They no longer need someone else to validate their emotions in order to trust that those emotions are real. This is what Carl Jung once described as reconnecting with the true self. The empath is no longer a version of who they were taught to be. They start living as who they really are, sometimes strong, sometimes vulnerable, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce. And the miracle is, when they become real, they begin to attract real people. The relationships built on roles start to fall away. Those who stayed only for gain, to extract and exploit, can no longer tolerate the new version of the empath, awake, clear, and no longer easy to manipulate. This isn't an easy journey. It takes courage to stand by yourself, even if it means walking away from the ones who once meant everything. But this very courage is what leads to true healing. The empath doesn't just escape the manipulator's grip, they become their own guide. First for themselves, and then for others still lost in the fog of self-doubt. By the time they reach this stage in life, they no longer crave a fair ending to everything that happened. They don't wait for apologies. They don't expect the other person to own up. They don't need acknowledgement from anyone but themselves. Because now they understand. Healing is not about fixing someone else. It's about reclaiming all the energy they unconsciously gave away for far too long. That's the moment they can look back at the one who hurt them and feel no hate. Not because they forgot, but because their heart is no longer enslaved by the thirst for emotional justice. Forgiveness, in this case, is not approval of the wrongdoing. It's the boldest act of reclaiming one's freedom. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." The empath, through awakening, has cut that unconscious thread. They now recognize the pattern: giving too much, receiving too little, then blaming themselves for not being enough. Now, they choose differently. They build boundaries not out of fear, but from self-worth. They don't have to raise their voice to be respected, just by no longer tolerating the intolerable. They make their stance clear. The person who once hurt them no longer holds the power to wound them. Because the empath has reclaimed their greatest power, the power to choose. To walk away. To protect their peace. To live truthfully, without playing a role. And that is the day they truly step into a new life. And then, something strange happens. They begin to feel light. Light in a way they've never known before. No longer waking up each morning bracing themselves to face someone who made them feel like they were always wrong. No longer falling asleep with a mind spinning over vague, controlling words. Their soul begins to open up space. And in that space, life begins to flow. They sit in silence without feeling anxious. They no longer check their phone constantly. No longer flinch at every message alert. They stop living in a constant state of alert. Their body, their mind, their emotions, for the first time in a very long time, finally enter a state of rest. This is the reward no one talks about when it comes to letting go of a toxic relationship. You don't just leave them. You leave behind the version of yourself who always doubted your worth. Who was always trying to prove you were enough. And when you stop fighting for approval, that's when you truly begin to live. Carl Jung once said, "No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And the empath, because they once walked deep into the darkness, can now see with clarity when they step out. They don't carry hatred. They carry lessons. They begin to carefully choose everything. Who's allowed into their life? Which words are worth believing? Which emotions deserve their attention? They live with intention. They're no longer pulled by others' emotions. No longer dimming their own light just to make others comfortable. And that is what makes them no longer so easily hurt. From here, a new chapter begins. No fireworks. No applause. Just a quiet morning, where the empath wakes up and realizes they don't have to pretend anymore. They no longer fake being okay when they're tired. They no longer play the role of the ever gentle, ever understanding, always available one. They begin to allow themselves to be real, with their strengths and their vulnerabilities. They laugh when they're happy, cry when they're hurt, get angry when their boundaries are crossed. And the miracle is, they no longer feel guilty for that. This is what Carl Jung called becoming whole, not perfect. The old empath tried to be perfect, kind, agreeable, compassionate, never disappointing anyone. But those unrealistic standards were exactly what made them so easy to exploit. Now, they no longer live to please others. They live to be honest with themselves. And it's only then that real relationships begin to form. Not ones built on emotional need or manipulation, but healthy connections, where people meet not to heal each other, but to grow together. They no longer need anyone to fill the emptiness, because they're no longer hollow. This empath is no longer the fragile soul easily swept into other people's drama. They are someone who has walked through hell within their own heart, and returned with eyes that see clearly, with a calm that runs deep. They don't rebel. They don't complain. They simply stand strong. And sometimes, standing strong is the highest form of power. And when the empath finally stands firm, something profound happens. They begin to see clearly the true nature of what once caused them pain. Not to repeat it, but to make sure they never repeat it again. They look back at the person who once manipulated them, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Now, they no longer ask, "Why did they do this to me?" Instead, they ask, "Why did I stay for so long?" That question doesn't carry blame. It carries awareness, a kind of maturity no school ever teaches. One that only comes through pain and a deep journey inward. That's when they realize the other person was never strong. They only knew how to exploit fear. The fear of being abandoned. The fear of being misunderstood. The fear of being alone. And it was that fear that once made the empath stay quiet, forgive too easily, hold on too tightly, and love far beyond their limits. But the moment the empath is no longer ruled by fear, the manipulator loses all their power. Because you can't control someone who no longer fears losing you. Someone who knows their worth, who knows what they deserve, and who is willing to walk away if they're not treated right. Carl Jung once said, "What you do not face will return as fate." And now, the empath has faced it all. No more denial, no more justifications. No more avoidance, only a heart that has grown, not in hate, but in clarity, a heart that has walked through fire, and now burns with its own light, no longer needing anyone to spark it, or hold it. This isn't a fairy tale ending. It's the beginning of something real, clean, honest, no longer built on trading kindness for permission to exist. And finally, when the empath has completed their journey back to themselves, something peaceful emerges. No more fear, no more rage, no more need to prove anything. They no longer try to be the light for others. Now, they simply are, and that is enough. No more forcing themselves to hold broken relationships together. No more silent compromises just to avoid conflict. No more looking into someone else's eyes and asking, "Am I enough?" Because now they know, their worth was never something others could define. It lives in the truth they choose to live by. Every single day, they start using the word, no, as a complete sentence. No explanations. No justifications. No apologies for protecting their peace. And from that place, new doors open. Lighter. More honest. No longer built on fear. The peace doesn't come from forgetting what happened. It comes from allowing it to stay in the past. As a lesson. As a milestone. As proof that yes, they once lost themselves, but they were brave enough to find their way back. Carl Jung didn't write comforting quotes. He left maps. Maps that lead deep into the human soul. And the empath, after everything, found the courage to walk into their own shadows, to meet their most painful parts, and return, not as a victim, but as a whole, integrated self. No one can control them now. With guilt trips, vague threats, or conditional love, they finally understand. Real love never asks you to abandon yourself. The day the empath snaps isn't the day they scream in anger. It's not when they explode in chaos. It's the day they go quiet. They rise. They walk away. And never look back. If you saw yourself in these quiet truths, subscribe to the channel. And take the next step with me on this journey of healing, understanding, and returning home to yourself.